All right, can you guys hear me? Christian, I'm good? All right, excellent. All right, everyone. Enjoying the conference? Great. Glad to hear it. So I am going to be talking about the RChain roadmap. I know a lot of you are very eager and anxious to learn about what some of the key milestones are in the project, what the dates are, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that part. We're also going to talk a little bit about the objectives. You know me, I'm all about getting things done in a very structured way with agendas. Any of you that have attended any of my meetings know. So here we go. Here's our agenda for our talk. We're going to try to teach you about how we do release planning, scoping, and requirements tracing. We're going to talk about key and incremental milestones included in the flight to Mercury. And then, most importantly, how you all can self-service this information. So you don't have to rely on contacting me or anyone on the PyroFX team to find out about how these things may shift, right, where the information is published. So you can always track, self-service, what you need to know about the RChain roadmap, because we're all about transparency and asynchronous communication. So you can self-service all this information via our tools. So without further ado, I'll dive right in. So let's talk at a high level about the RChain development process, right? We are using iterative agile. There are very good reasons for this, right? We're innovating. So we want to use this kind of a process because it allows us to demonstrate progress, release early and often, right? Balancing that with really, really good development practices around specifications and requirements traceability. And you'll hear a lot of mixed signals about Agile, about the Agile development process, the Agile methodology. And Agile being done correctly doesn't give you the right to step away from the specification and requirements process, right? What it lets you do is let a feature grow and evolve over time and get user feedback early and often in that process. And we're trying to use that in our development process because that's going to let us release early and often, demonstrate progress, and create working software. And a lot of what we're building is theoretical. It's not been done before. And so getting the software running is really, really important for us to demonstrate what is going to actually work. We specify our releases 60 to 90 days in advance, right? So at a very high level, we're understanding what we expect the release to demonstrate, and then we talk about that release plan with stakeholders, and then we take that release plan to the developers, and then they start working through the implementation details. And then from that fall out action items, tickets, and specifications. So we're going to repeat this process over and over and over again until we hit Mercury. Why do I not see? Oh, there we go. So this is what we've done so far. So we've already done this 4 or 5 times. And with each release, we're getting better and better and better at our release process. And it's getting smoother and smoother. And we're identifying challenges in the release process, and we're able to then scope those incremental improvements into future releases. And a lot of this involves engineering work, right? So if you talk about continuous integration, packaging, hermetic builds, deployments, all of these things need to be automated, and they all require engineering activity. We don't want to leave those activities till the end, right? Because that's a really bad idea. We want to know that we can release in an automated fashion. We can test in an automated fashion. We want to do that very incrementally. A little bit about self-service here. So on developer.rchain.coop, you can see the project status, big red letters, roadmap flight to Mercury. We'll talk about the high-level milestones on the page. And then here you'll see some links underneath, the roadmap, the release plans, GitHub, and development team updates. So you can always go to that website, and you're going to find those links there, and that's going to give you a shortcut directly to the information that's stored in our Confluence and our Jira instances. So let's go into a little bit of detail here. So we're going to walk through the last release we completed, which was Node 0.2. We shipped this release at the end of March. So if you look at this release plan page, you're going to see the milestones running up to the release. We typically sprint for 2 sprints, sometimes 2.5, sometimes 1.5, depending on the scope of the release and the way the calendars are lining up. Our goal is to try to release close to the end of the month every month. You typically hear that when you're planning releases, getting to scope completeness and hitting your dates, you're going to get to pick between which piece of the triangle you want. We've decided that we're going to ship something on target every month. There may be minor adjustments to the scope, and those features that don't make it in by those 2 iterations will simply just roll over to the next release, right? So the goal being is that we push as hard as we can to ship as much functionality as we can, with the caveat that some things may not be completely baked in time for the release cycle. In that case, they get into the next release train. You can see here the document status. This was approved. The release status was released. As we look at some of the other release plans, you'll get a little bit more clarity on the different phases which the document goes through. Here you'll see who the key actors are on the release, which teams are involved, and who the representatives are from each team. So the release summary, we actually improved the process from 2 to 3, so the 3 release plans are going to look a little different, but it was a good change. So you see here the simple overview and the technical overview. What's special about this release, and what are we doing differently? This information gives you basically the specification of what is in the release, what the release should be able to demonstrate, what you can expect to get out of the release as a developer, as an end user. It will talk in depth about some of the features and functionality and the key value propositions in the release. On the right-hand side is a full scope of all the issues in the release, right? So we have all of our release readiness and release planning issues that we target, in addition to the actual core features and functionality, or what I call development tickets. So there's development work and non-development work, but we like to track everything in a single place so you can see those issues on the right-hand side of the release pages. So by way of example, for Node.2, this release integrated the rolling interpreter into the RChain node and creates a rolling runtime environment in the RChain node and introduces an encryption handshake. So really succinct, short, this is what is happening in this release. And then there's a much deeper technical overview. Then we talk about the release packaging, if we're making any changes to the packages that we're offering. For the most part, these are the packages we'll probably run through to Mercury with. There's also going to be information on where you can file issues and where you go for support. If you have a process that would consume one of these release plans, by example, if you're doing marketing, marketing outreach, developer outreach, and you find you need information to be exposed on these release plans, that these topics do not answer your questions, please drop me a note. And we can absolutely incorporate what it is you need into these pages so you can self-service. So let's talk about Node 3. So this is what is currently in flight. You can see that our release date for Node 3 is May 3rd. Our goal is to always do a membership demo the day before we release, or sooner, but typically we need to consume as much of our time as we can on development activities and release readiness. So usually you'll find that the membership demo is the day before we actually launch. And the release date is when the announcements go out, any marketing material goes out, Medium articles are posted, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really the definition of launch from our perspective. You'll notice the document status says the document status is complete, and the release status is in development, in dev. So we're actively working on the development task for this release. So simple overview. Node 3 demonstrates consensus messages over the RChain peer-to-peer network. Detailed technical overview. I'm not going to read the text on the screen, but you'll see that there is quite a bit in terms of features in Node 3. So this is the new piece we added to our release plans. What will this release be able to demonstrate? So this is where we're introducing what I like to refer as one type of traceability matrix. We have other traceability matrices. If we have time, I can share those with you. But here we've got a demoable feature, a person that is responsible for delivering that feature, and then the core tickets associated with that feature, as well as the sprints those have been planned in. You can track the progress of the feature. As you can see, that feature is 4/5 done with respect to actually implementation and unit testing. Similarly, another feature here for improved communications, gRPC API, standard out and standard error channels. Those of you who attended Kyle and Henry's talk, you probably heard about how this was implemented in detail. So those were recently implemented. They'll be shipping with Node 3. And then the work on the consensus protocol that's being led by Michael and Kent. There's the tickets that are associated with that. And you'll see over here on the right, as you look, you'll see that there's some continuous integration work that Jeremy's doing. There's some testing work that Jeremy's doing. So there's a good amount of work that is related to what I like to call release efficiency, right? So as part of Node 3, one of the things we want to do is we want our continuous integration server to actually stand up 3 nodes in a mini-net and validate that the nodes communicate correctly with each other, that they can exchange a shared secret, get ready for the TLS testing, validate that they're actually sending consensus messages, because these are not tests that you can run via unit tests. You actually need to start standing up nodes. So we're going to do that now. So by the time we need to stand up a test net, or any one of the developers needs a test net for their testing, they can just call a script and instantiate n number of nodes with the latest software so they can test their features independent of needing to use a physical test net. So those are some of the efficiencies, what I like to refer to as, engineering best practices and development process efficiencies that we want in place so we can rapidly release, right? And it's funny, a lot of companies that want to do Agile don't actually invest in these kinds of tools. And it's very, very hard to release software every 4 weeks if you're spending a week in integration testing and manual testing. It's just not sustainable. So you have to invest in these kinds of tools and these kinds of systems to support rapid engineering and rapid development. And so you'll see here we've got the CI work that I referred to. And then we've got some Rolang language features. So interesting thing, with the Rolang language features, it's really rate limited by how much Kyle can get done. So as Kyle is able to get more features implemented into the Rolang interpreter, those will just roll into the releases bit by bit by bit. So our focus on the interpreter after the large Node 0.2 release is really about robustness and added features and functionality. And so you'll see that there will be, as more issues are completed, more features are completed, those will just drop into the release bit by bit by bit. So I'm going to pause here for a moment, and I threw a lot of information at all of you. Are there any questions?
The simple question, hermetic build. So what does hermetic mean? That's a new term in this context for me.
Sure. So build hermeticism means that irrespective, so let me just put it to you in a user story kind of thing, right? I'm a developer, I go to Git, I want to build the RChain software. Go on my machine, I do a Git clone. I've identified that you need to have Ubuntu running, fine, I have that. I do a Git clone, I run build, and I get an RChain node. That RChain node is exactly the same, irrespective of anything else. I don't have to manage any dependencies. I don't have to, right? It's a very easy, consistent, reliable build. And we need that for security, right? Because if we can't control all of our dependencies and know for darn sure that any dependent library we get is the exact correct version and we know all the bits that are in there, we can't have confidence from a security perspective of what we're shipping. So build hermeticism isn't easy to achieve, and it's fairly expensive, but it is extremely important. And it is something we will need to focus on and actively invest in. Any other questions? Clear as mud? Great. All right, we'll talk about Node 4. So Node 4, document status a little different. So document's been approved, and we're now in the planning phase. And what that means is I'm working actively with the developers to come up with the detailed issues and tasking that they need to implement this release. As you'll see, this release is due to ship around May 31st, end of May. So this is about, the release has been specified, it's been approved in terms of what the release will deliver, and we're working out the how, right? Who's going to do what? How are they going to do it? How long is it going to take? What does the implementation look like? What are the details for the implementation? Who's going to do the work? Do we have enough resources? All those product management type questions. So one of the things we're going to offer in the release are more Rolang language features. Not finalized, but this is what we're proposing based off of the Rolang roadmap. Enhanced metrics. We've talked about wanting to support site reliability requirements, right? So before we implement any of the higher level features in the software, we want to make sure that we know how those features are going to perform right from the beginning. What that means is we need to be able to measure and monitor a wide variety of metrics and subsystems on the node. So we have a lot of time to optimize them, optimize the performance for those features over time. We have a very ambitious and aggressive goal to get to 40,000 COM events per second. And that means we're going to need to really understand how the tuple space is performing, because that's where all that magic happens. We'll need to know how communications is performing, so we know that the messages are being, how noisy the network is, if it's very chatty, does it need to be that chatty, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of questions and a lot of performance tuning that we'll need to do, and in order to do that, we're going to need metrics. So we'll be laying down a very basic metrics API that the internal development team can use to emit those numbers for measurement purposes. That's been specified and scoped out. We're also refactoring the the communications layer, as we've talked about, so TLS for communications, and there's some work that's been scoped for that. This release is pretty close to being locked down in terms of scope, because most of it's already been targeted and planned out. Any questions? Node 4? Okay. Node 5. So Node 5 is a big one. Node 5 is where we'll be able to observe the blockchain. There's a good chunk of work here that still needs to be specified in terms of how we're going to make it all work. But at a high level, Node 5 is when you can expect to see validator bonding and unbonding, Casper protocol, storage, history and rollback, Genesis block, the execution of transactions, block proposition, And then I hope to have a preliminary measure of COM events. So we start to understand how big the gap is, what the gap is, if there is a gap, so we can performance tune the ultimate RChain network to get us to the transaction limits that or the transaction threshold that we want to hit. We'll also have a basic wallet, and my hope is to have a JSON API and an API that points to a wallet, so you'll be able to perform an arbitrary transfer of some currency. We won't have much in the way of validator rewards or costing, right? Your validators in this particular release will be able to bond with a purse and some token within it, but it's not going to have the full costing model that's coming later. Also hope to have a gRPC service to explore blocks. So return the contents of a block at a given block hash, return the contents of a block given a specific block height, and this will change post-sharding, right? The way we'll be able to reference a block will have to be different. We can't use traditional block heights because the RChain network is sharded. These are proposed, well, I've talked to Nash and Greg about it, and they definitely like these. We'll have to talk to the developers and see what they can actually achieve by this time frame. And to talk about the time frame, it is July 12th is the release date for this. So by this time, we should have a mini net. You should be able to stand up a number of RChain nodes and observe the blockchain if you wish. We won't have a test net as yet set up for our, the reflective folks and the Pythia folks to start deploying dApps. My intention is to have that the following release for node 6. How much I fleshed out node 6? A little bit. So talk about node 6. Node 6, the release date is, now understand guys, it's getting a little squishy here, right? So we're talking August. So the scope, as we get further out, right, we have the cone of uncertainty, so as we get further away from today, it becomes less and less clear as to what's going to be in the releases as things are going to shift back and forth. But I have confidence that we'll be releasing something on August 2nd. I hope that it will be something meaningful, right, involving a blockchain and some costing information, costing functionality. So validator rewards, sender pays. So this is the initial portion of the costing model for RChain, right? We haven't sat down to specify the costing model yet. So a lot of this is what we want to do. This is where we see it fitting in the roadmap. It's a logical next step after having a blockchain, right, is to now start implementing some of the costing and validator rewards. It is with this release that I intend to offer a public test net for people to interact with, right? It felt reasonable to have at least some kind of concept of validator rewards and cost for execution in place. So when you're authoring your applications, you can get some kind of semblance of idea of what it's going to cost. I'm going to pause here and ask if there's any questions.
On the back on the 0.5 release, I know that wallet, and I assume that corresponds to purses. This is more of a internal mechanism than an external wallet, is my perception. And then also the currency or token here is not the rev yet, right? This is just a placeholder value. But my question, given that rough understanding, is it meaningful to develop applications against that yet in Rolang? Or does that need to send? So, for example, to develop an external user wallet, is it too early on node 0.5? Or is it worthwhile to start that effort?
I think it's 100% worthwhile. Because understand, we want feedback. So the sooner we can have people actually using the platform, the better. Because it fleshes out requirements. And there is a great deal you can do with Node 5 in that you will now be able to observe your application interactions with the blockchain. Right? The wallet is there, so what I really want to get to is the measurement of the COM events, right? That's my big thing. And so at a minimum, just transacting a token back and forth, I want to use that to measure the performance. I want to start measuring the performance as soon as I possibly can. So that was my primary motivation for even including a wallet, because then I would imagine some kind of a script calling that API that's going to just do a whole bunch of transactions, and we're going to use that for performance measurement.
Got it. And what's the nature of that API? Is that a Rolang API, or is that something at a, if you will, a higher level?
Oh, yeah, I didn't specify. It's a node. It's the gRPC protobuf, gRPC API.
Protobuf. Okay.
Yeah,
got it.
protobuf. Yeah,
Coming
gRPC
in at that
API.
level.
I said node API, but I didn't specify. Good catch. I didn't specify that it needs to be
No,
gRPC.
it just was partly my understanding. So, so at that, I don't recall, you may have covered this, about cryptographic signing of transactions. Is that in Node 0.5 or is that later?
It's actually in Node, in order to do validator bonding and unbonding, the cryptography will actually be done in 4 and 3.
Okay, excellent, thanks.
Yep. Other questions? Okay. So those are the release plans that I have fleshed out. I think I feel like I need to go back to my presentation and make sure that I'm on track. So my notes tell me that I'm to show you how to watch for updates. So as I indicated that I want everybody to try to self-service this in as much as they can, you can go to our Confluence and Jira site and register for an account with your primary email. You can click this handy dandy little kazoo called an eyeball that lets you watch that page. And you will get emails when this page updates. So I have to warn you, I work iteratively. See how the developers are laughing over here because they get a lot of email from Medha. Medha's actively working on release plans. So set a filter. You're most welcome to watch the space. Just know that there'll be a good amount of email that'll come in, right? Set up a filter so it's not constantly spamming your account. But by all means, if there's a particular release you're really keen on watching, go to the wiki and self-service that for yourself. The core wiki page has all the release plans listed down here, along with the technical specifications. We are working on all the release plans between here and Mercury, getting everything specified, lined up, tasked out, and estimated. The most recent ones that are being updated will bubble to the top. You're also welcome to comment on any of the release plans if you have any questions. I look at these very, very regularly, so know that your comments will actually send me an email as well, and I'll be able to see them on the page. Expect that we are making updates to the releases up to the day we lock, which is 30 days before. And then sometimes we have issues that land into the release because they're completed. So you won't necessarily get an email. If an issue winds up being scoped in a release, you're not necessarily going to get that email. So it is good to occasionally check in on those release plans and take a look. If there's a specific issue that you're particularly interested in, you can also watch that issue, right? So Atlassian supports that feature as well, where you can watch a specific issue. So if you're like, boy, oh boy, I really want to know when the cryptography is available in Rolang, then you can go to the release page, you can identify that issue in the traceability matrix, you can click on that issue, and then you can watch it. And then if there's an update to the issue status, you'll get an email. So it's a great way for everyone who wants to get self-service updates. That's how you do it. Does that make sense? I don't want to spend a bunch of time during the presentation to walk you guys through the vagaries of how Confluence works, but I trust it's fairly straightforward. Let's talk a little bit about. So here on the left-hand side, you will see specifications. find a good specification. So we can take a look at the Node Powerbox specification here. So I talked about traceability matrices for the release plans. There's another level of traceability matrices which talks more about an epic level. And an epic, the way we are implementing it in our development process, really is a high-level feature. It's something kind of big that will take many, many sprints to implement. It's a feature that will grow over time, right, as we iteratively, incrementally improve the feature until it's complete. So the Node Powerbox is a great example. The Node Powerbox is an object capability. It involves an object capabilities architecture that lets Rolang create side effects on the machine. So these are the features that will enable you to create a web server using Rolang, by example. Or if you want to use our node to do content delivery, you'll have to use some of the features specified in the specification. So it's kind of two levels, right? So you've got the big vision of the feature, and that has to be broken down into small pieces. And each of those pieces get scoped into a release plan. And from the release plan, they wind up on the sprint board, right? So that's how you kind of trace it all the way through. So here you'll see some fixed versions, right, for some of the releases. That's how I keep track of how this thing is growing, how it's evolving over time. Any questions on that? Because it's really easy to do, I did this in a Google Sheet at a very high level. There is a link. Kelly, keep me honest here. There's a link on the developer co-op site. So you can get to this particular sheet on developer.rchain.coop. I have done the traditional swim lanes underneath and the release vehicles up top. I wish there was a way for me to, let's see if I can do that. Aha, there we go. Great. Try to get a little bit more real estate on the screen. So you'll see we're here in April. Because we want to see the future. All right. So we're here working in April. We've got Node 3, crypto, message encryption, demonstrate consensus messages. A revision of the Rolang interpreter, that's what SDK 0.2 implies. On the virtual machine, we're still working on the transition function and primitives. So each of these swim lanes references one of the components of the project. So we've got the node in green, communications, storage, contracts. We've got everything in purple talks about testing, what our testing program is, consensus, and then the compiler/interpreter, cost, and then testnet infrastructure. So you can definitely self-service this via the website. So let's talk a little bit about, we reviewed Node 4, we reviewed Node 5. You'll see that the storage team is going to be very busy working on history and rollback. That's really the big piece that needs to get done in order to support the Node 5 release. Node 6, you'll see here we've got the testnet and partial costing. Node 7 is where we have sharding. So Node 7 in the August timeframe is when you can expect to see namespace sharding to be implemented and working. And then Node 8 is when you'll see the name registry, which is what Nash and Mike talked about this morning. My intention is to have everything done by October, and then we have 60 days for performance tuning. Spit and polish, gotchas, because those always happen in every project. I fully expect that once we get into actually testing a working implementation, we're going to learn about a whole bunch of things that we need to include, right? And that's what those 60 days at the end are for. We're pushing very, very hard. I've tried to front load as much as I can early on to the project to give ourselves time for any and all of those gotchas that could potentially get us closer to the end. So I'm going to stop here again and ask if there's any questions.
You noticed I sit close to the microphone.
I noticed that, yeah.
Medha, you're doing an excellent job. Question about wallets, again. So certainly a node operator will need some form of basic wallet API or command line interface. So when I think about what the bare minimum is, it would be a command line interface kind of interface. But what are the plans? Because I reviewed this and I couldn't quite grok what the intentions for the user experience for a wallet is in Mercury.
So we can talk a little bit about the user experience for the node operator, and I think that's, by extension, going to answer your question. So we're going to, the gRPC API is going to have the largest surface area for the node. So first and foremost, we're going to expose any and all capabilities via that API. We're also going to offer a JSON and REST API as well, because we recognize that there are customers and clients that are going to be looking for that. So that's, but those won't necessarily have as wide a surface area. They will consume the gRPC API. It's our intention to develop a light web client in Python for the node that will expose all of the gRPC functions. So at a high level, this is what it looks like, right? I want to be a node operator. I go ahead and get the Debian or RPM package. I install it on the server. I boot it up. It boots. And the first thing I'm presented upon boot is a web interface. And from there, I can learn everything I need to learn about how I can administer and manage the node. One of those things will be the wallet. Make sense? I mean, I'm pretty crazy when it comes to user experience. I mean, what I tell the team, and it's kind of a joke, is that it has to be meta-proof. Like, if I can't do it, it's not easy enough, right? So trust that it's going to be a very, very easy user interface, and it's going to follow the paradigm that system administrators would expect in terms of managing a server, a Linux server. Did I answer your question? Yes. Okay, great. Other questions?
So I see in your calendar up there that it mentions SDK 0.2.3. I didn't see release plans for those. Is there, can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so our intention is, when I talk about the actual SDK, I'm talking about improvements on the rolling language and the interpreter. Our intention is that so the SDK really comprises documentation and how to use the rolling language. That's what I see as a software development kit, is really, here's how to use the rolling language. We're not building an IDE plugin as part of the platform, per se, but this is really about the evolution of the rolling language as when I talk about SDK. From a rolling author's perspective, now you'll see the virtual machine, you've got the virtual machine, we have the interpreter. The virtual machine is going to plug in the interpreter as a JIT, so there should be no change to the user experience from a contract author's perspective. But there are initiatives in the community to develop an IntelliJ plugin and other development toolkit support. But that's really what the SDK is all about. It's about improvements to the tutorials, documentation on the rolling language, and increased support so developers know what to expect in the language. Great.
Question.
Yes, sir.
So we are releasing every month, and what are the expectations from the end user? What kind of feedback you are expecting? And every release is you are adding some features, but there's no clear direction for end users how they can test some of the features and what you're expecting.
That's really good feedback. So we haven't, I haven't talked too much about a beta program in here as yet in terms of structured test cases, and I would think that that would fall out of the release plans where it says what can developers expect to do in this release vis-a-vis the last release, right? So these are the new features and functionality that you can expect in this release versus the last release. But with respect to having a targeted beta program, I haven't set up anything like that. I believe that once some of the seed companies that will be implementing against the testnet, when they start coming online, we'll need to set up a much more formal mechanism for them to file both enhancements and feature requests. Barring that, if you find a bug, you can log a bug in Jira. And we'll tell you if that is something that should be working right now or if it needs to go on the backlog.
So on the same token, the continued question is, what kind of feature set, how they can test them? I think the direction I wanted to go was you are releasing features, but some of the features they may not be integrated well enough as an end user or as a developer. I can test those features. I think that's what I'm looking for as an answer is, how these features should be integrated so that we can test in our products.
I think that's one of the best improvements of the release plan when you see Node Point 3 and Node Point 3 and going forward is in those release plans, we're starting to think more of the end user, thanks to some feedback from the dev team, and thinking about what does this release demonstrate. And when we say demonstrate, that is something obviously that the dev team needs to be able to demonstrate, and the end user can also do the same. Does that make sense? Okay.
So slightly different question there, but on the same spin. Are there test cases you're preparing for the community to use to be able to look at and say, okay, we've stressed this enough, or is somebody else, or are you going to crowdsource that to the co-op members?
Yeah, so what you're asking for is actually beta planning and beta program planning, and I think that we're going to be pretty close to laying some of that pipeline for that in terms of detailed documentation on how the features work. I think that's the other side of it too, right, is, okay, we have consensus here, we have Rolang here, but what are the details in terms of like wanting a much more detailed user guide about the nuances of Rolang, right, versus just a simple tutorial?
No, I'm actually asking for test plans. System integration, are there, or should we be thinking about adding that and getting that from the community? And are there going to be test tools that the dev team recommends?
It's a great point. I think that is something that I will need to start focusing on aggressively. I have a long and colored history with quality assurance and testing, and I'm very familiar with writing test plans. So at some point when we get to integration testing, right now the team has been purely focusing on unit testing and automating all those unit tests, but we are at a phase now very shortly with Node 3 and Node 4, we'll start thinking about system integration tests. Exactly.
Thank you.
And I do have a long history in quality assurance, and I'll be spearheading those.
And if anybody wants to build test tools, happy to fund it.
I'm sure this is going to be the last question. So, somebody talked about the SDK. So in the same release plan, one of the things I think I would expect that some of the API the DApp guys could use, from an abstraction point of view, I think we should include either 0.7 or 0.6 version so that Bithia or Reflexive, all the teams, they're going to use, I think, some exposure to the API or some sort of documentation around APIs.
Absolutely, yeah.
And
there will absolutely be documentation. So when a feature is delivered, there's an expectation that there's documentation to go along with it. So when we release the gRPC protobuf API, there will be documentation on how to interrogate the API, what data structures you can expect to get back, et cetera, et cetera. It's part and parcel.
So it's part of the release, not necessarily a separate portion of API.
Correct.
API set or
Correct.
SDK.
I mean, I think you can look at the storage release that we recently did as a great example, right? That storage release came with all the necessary developer documentation, a getting started guide, a tutorial, and we're going to continue to do that with all of our API releases. Go ahead.
Could you bring up the Google Doc calendar?
Oh, you want to see the roadmap again? Mm-hmm.
So under June, you have the wallet there in gray. And in a few places you reference the Node API.
Uh-huh.
Is the Node API what the wallet is consuming?
The Node API exposes the wallet, right? So the Node is going to run as a daemon, and so the way you interact with the Node is going to be via the API, and then eventually a very light, thin client user interface.
Yeah. So that is what the wallet will consume.
Yeah.
So then it's listed in a couple places, March and April. If I want more specifics about what's going to be like the rollout for the Node API, is that listed in those the Atlassian?
Yes, the details will be in the release plans. And so, like I said, if you have questions and you're not getting enough clarity in the release plans, by all means, add some comments, create an account, add some comments, and I will get that feedback immediately. and I can go ahead and refine those, and all feedback is welcome. So it'll help clarify and refine what your needs are as a developer. So that would be terrific.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm getting the 5-minute warning from Kelly. Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Quick, 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 run, run, run. Oh, right under the radar. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wonder, like, when in which version the customer will be developed, released?
Node 5.
Node 5. Okay, thanks.
With respect to, I guess, mainly the development of Rolang and getting your hands on actually trying to write some contracts in that. If I were to organize a meetup and wanted to get people involved and try out writing some contracts, when do you expect the tools to be mature enough in order to not make that a painful experience for everybody involved?
When you say painful, give me a little bit more detail. In all seriousness, yeah.
Well, so I was toying around with the REPL thing, and it crashes every time there's a syntax error, for example. That was a little bit painful. I mean, there might be other ways to try it out besides the REPL, but you know, for a general crowd of people that are familiar with programming but obviously haven't done Rolang programming before, what's your sort of rough take?
We have a ticket for a specification for error model in Rolang. We are working on improving error handling. Kyle is aware that it's a terrible user experience at the moment, so every time you hit a syntax error, having the REPL crashes, right? So we're working on specifying how we're going to handle error handling in Rolang specifically, and one of the most basic things is that the REPL should not crash when you get a syntax error. So your feedback is well noted. I would fully expect within the next 30 to 45 days that we should start having something improved, right? We're going to iterate on that.
I can actually speak to the REPL crash because I've been working on that. And there's actually in-flight work. So at the very least, you will not exit out of the REPL, which was the original behavior, and very bad. So that is actually currently in the Rolang CLI itself, and should probably be into the node in the matter of days.
Yeah, node 3 then. I pulled up the backlog thinking that there was already a resolved issue for it, but you guys are doing work off the table. I'm never going to complain with you guys doing more work than I've asked for. It's always appreciated. Any other questions?
So one suggestion. So do you have any plan to include a closed beta? I mean, at this moment, all the developers are involved in testing and releasing portion. Would you be open to include some die-hard RChain fan to do some preliminary testing before it's rolled out to wider group? The direction I'm going, the region, one of the audience was asking, they have painful experience, right? We can avoid this kind of situation before it goes out to wider audience. Then you have, few people from community. They may not be involved in development directly, but they can help testing before it goes out to everybody else.
Well, so to be clear, we weren't surprised that the interpreter and the REPL was crashing as a result of a syntax error. We knew that going in, right? And so the software is still very much under active development. And so it's one of those things where there are going to be bugs in the software, and we're going to keep working hard to resolve those bugs as quickly as we can, but the software is still, it's alpha software, pre-release software. That's why it's 0.3. Now, I'm not saying that it's okay to release poor quality software. That's not what I'm saying. But what I want to do is I want to get the interpreter in the hands of people with caveats saying, yes, we know this is bad. Just bear with us, right, as we work the kinks out. And then this fast follow-on release, we're going to make it more robust. We're going to improve the error handling. But I don't want to hold back the functionality because there's issues with the release. I'd rather document and keep pushing forward. But your advice is noted. Your advice is well taken. But what my goal is to capture the feedback and implement it and do fast follow-on releases. So again, release early and often. Okay, we're at time. Thank you everyone for your attention. And don't hesitate to reach out